Most people consider Clemson to be the best or second best team in college football. They have the Friday night to themselves against Syracuse at the Carrier Dome. We bring in John Casilla from Noon's Magician, who joins us on a regular basis to talk Syracuse football and get us set for the Orange and the Tigers tonight. A lot of orange on the field, maybe a little blue as well, and purple. John, how you doing tonight?
Doing well, Mark. How about yourself?
Doing just fine. So we're just about just a couple hours away from kickoff, so we'll have to run through this preview. And this is going to be the first time that a lot of people, including myself, are going to see Syracuse. So if you're watching college football, you're, of course, going to watch this one on a Friday night. And Syracuse obviously caught quite a few eyeballs for their performance at LSU. And despite the Bayou Bengals being down, it's still an LSU crew with a ton of talent. And that was a one-possession game and very close up until the end. And so just kind of update us on where Syracuse stands, the highs, the lows, the bright spots, and what we can expect to see tonight.
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting season so far, to be honest. Like, we'd love to have not lost to Middle Tennessee State, but a lot of folks who are still dismissing us are kind of focusing in on that one. I don't blame them for it, but a lot of weird things going on there. Scott Schaefer, our former head coach, is the defensive coordinator for the Blue Raiders. So that, I think, got into a lot of players' heads more than they probably anticipated. Middle Tennessee really blitzed us pretty heavily, kind of set a blueprint out for a lot of other teams. You saw it with Pitt last week, too, really kind of blitzing us, not just on the perimeter, but sending a lot of pass rush through the middle where the line can easily kind of collapse since we have a lot of younger players in the interior line on offense. The three losses we have this year have all been by single digits. The LSU game was pretty tight. Until LSU finally punched it in towards the end. Some people would debate whether or not the onside kick there in the fourth quarter had anything to do with that loss. Maybe, although Dino Babers claims he didn't even order it up, so I wouldn't put that on him. I know in the NC State game that was an actual onside kick. Another one where a couple calls go a different way. Like, we could potentially be looking at an overtime game against NC State, who's now rising in the polls. That said, we're not a perfect team. The defense is much, much better, but secondary is still a problem. I think our pass rush, while we can get penetration, we still can't really get a ton of tackles on opposing quarterbacks is problematic. Without Ahmed Atawo this year on offense, we don't really have much of a capable deep threat. Changed what the offense looks like compared to last year, seeing a lot more short throws, which is making it tougher to kind of move down the field quickly, like we saw last year when we were able to get a couple short screens, get a couple runs up the middle to kind of draw on the defense, and then exploit some single coverage on the outside. So that's not something that we've been able to get as much of this year, and it's definitely hurt the pace of things a little bit. But more than that, it's hurt our ability to get the kind of yardage outputs we were getting early last year.
John Casillo joining us from Noon's Magician, with Syracuse hosting Clemson on a Friday night, and the Cuse off to a decent start and certainly playing much better football, as John articulated, against NC State, a team that's now knocked off Louisville and Florida State, and Syracuse within one score of that game, and also at LSU against the Tigers, who aren't quite up to snuff, but still a very talented team. So Syracuse showing us what they are capable of. Huge underdogs in this game. Nobody's expecting them to win. But as we talked about before we started to record, I'm seeing tweets and social media posts from Clemson people that are just slightly nervous about Syracuse's ability on offense, and the tempo maybe being not the best matchup for a Clemson defense that's arguably the best in college football.
I think the tempo is just going to keep us around for a little bit longer than the talent would dictate. I still think that means Clemson has this game in hand midway through the third, but I think they're also projecting a little bit of those Friday night games against BC that they've had in the past, where Clemson just comes out a little, lackadaisical, doesn't really seem like they want to be there. And I think a lot of Tigers fans are kind of viewing this as another one of those. Obviously, us playing at home in the Dome, we don't have, to worry about weather. So our offense should be operating at peak efficiency in that case. Like I was mentioning before we started recording too, like, their offense is probably fine no matter who's a quarterback. But if Kelly Bryant's out there and he's not 100%, that might change things only a little bit, because his mobility, while he is a good passer, his mobility is really a key. We're not great at stopping mobile quarterbacks, haven't been for years. So if they send him out at maybe 80% and he's not really as agile, he can't really get to the edge, running the football. Potentially make this one drag on and be more competitive for longer than at least the Vegas odds indicate.
So, John, has this season thus far played out? I would think in terms of wins and losses, it has played out to what you would expected, but considering the one-score efforts against NC State and maybe the Wolfpack actually being a little bit better than we anticipated, we thought they would be a fringe top 25 team. The effort at LSU, yes, the Middle Tennessee State game was a disappointment in regards to you maybe should win that game, but it wasn't a huge surprise. It was pretty much a toss-up from what I remember in terms of a point spread within a touchdown, something in that range. Is the team basically where you expected them to be? And you've got to be maneuvering that path, I would think, to a bowl game and thinking about what you need to do from here on out to make it to postseason play.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we would have been 4-2. I think, I talked about this with a lot of our fans. If you change out the Pitt and Middle Tennessee games and you give us the loss versus Pitt and the win against Middle Tennessee, I think everyone's in a lot better headspace. From a fan perspective, you won the games that you were expected to. You lost the games you were expected to. The big issue for us isn't necessarily, we're better, but the issue is you look at the remaining schedule. You got this home game against Clemson. You got road games at Louisville, at Miami, at Florida State. We have Wake Forest, we have BC. BC is probably a win, but other than that, you look at the rest of those games, and they're all top 30, top 35 teams right now, depending on the metrics you're looking at. That's not really an easy road, and we really needed that Middle Tennessee game and win that Pitt game to start 4-2, and then give ourselves a little leeway. So now Wake becomes a must-win, and then we also have to then upset one of these top 25 caliber teams. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can pull off some, 5-7 Hail Mary invite tomfoolery towards the end of the season, like other teams have in the last few years. But it's definitely not going to be an easy stretch the rest of the way.
Well, certainly at some point you want to see the results, but the indications against the teams that we mentioned has to be good. And I would think, actually, for me, if I were a Syracuse fan, I would take the Pitt win over the Middle Tennessee because of, number one, it being more recent, so showing signs of development and progress later in the season, and then also the obvious of being an ACC game, an ACC win, but also a program that you have to measure yourself against year to year and seeing that progress and that you were better this particular year than a Middle Tennessee that you may never see again and really are difficult to rate them as a group of 5 team.
Oh, yeah. And like I said, having Schaefer there as a defense coordinator makes that game even more of an anomaly. I would much rather measure myself against Pitt, BC when they're good, Wake. Those are the programs that, for better or for worse, we're going to be measuring ourselves against until we can get even better and get into that next echelon of teams. I'm not holding my breath this year. Maybe next we can. But yeah, for right now, beating teams like Pitt is a great step in the right direction. And when you couple that with losing to quality opponents on the road by, a touchdown or so, that all seems like, a step in the right direction for me.
All right, John Casillo jumping on board from Noons Magician to help us set up the Clemson-Syracuse game at the Carrier Dome on a Friday night. All right, John, we appreciate you giving us some insight.
Yeah, no problem.